There's a moment in every woman's life when she realizes the people she has given everything to have been quietly taking her for granted. And for me, Margaret Lawson, that moment came at gate B19 of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport on a Thursday morning that would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and family. Because while I had raised my daughter Caroline to be strong, independent, and capable, I never expected that strength would harden into a coldness that could dismiss me so easily. And at 74 years old, after surviving widowhood, running a household alone, and giving decades of my life to motherhood, I thought I had seen heartbreak in all its forms. But I was wrong, and that Thursday proved it beyond a doubt. The day began like every travel day I had known, my carry-on packed with the careful precision that comes from years of making sure everything was just right for everyone else before myself, my medications tucked neatly into their dispenser, my travel folder, an elegant leather one Caroline had given me 4 Christmases ago, slipped into the outer pocket for easy access, my outfit chosen with care, a soft gray pantsuit that Caroline had once complimented me on, because even at this age, a mother still wants to make her child smile with pride. And as I settled into the Uber that took me to the airport, I let myself feel something I hadn't in years, genuine excitement, because Caroline had called me in April, her voice dancing with happiness as she told me about their family vacation to the Bahamas. "Mom, Brian got his bonus and we're finally going. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you came with us?" she had said, and I had clutched the phone with trembling fingers, saying yes before she even finished, because after so many lonely dinners, so many nights staring at Walter's empty chair, the idea of being included in something joyful with my family felt like sunlight after a long winter, and for months I lived for that trip, researching Nassau, brushing up on island history, even buying a new swimsuit though I hadn't put one on in nearly a decade, all because Caroline had invited me not as an afterthought, I thought, but as part of her dream, part of her family. And so that morning when I arrived at gate B19 2 hours early, the way I always do, my heart was light, and I pictured the look on my grandchildren's faces when they saw me, Daniel with his lanky frame and that mop of brown hair, and Madison, my sweet Madison, who loved to braid my silver hair whenever I visited, and I thought of the hugs, the chatter, the togetherness that had been missing from my life. But when I finally saw them at 9:30, Caroline striding in her tailored blazer, Brian dragging their oversized luggage, the kids trailing behind with headphones strung around their necks, the smile froze on my lips. Because instead of the warm embrace I craved, Caroline's face was tight, her eyes nervous, Brian avoiding me as if the sight of me hurt his pride somehow. And the kids, though they gave me distracted hugs, seemed subdued, almost coached. And then came those 4 words, "Mom, we need to talk." Words that cracked through my chest like ice. And I knew in my bones nothing good ever follows that phrase. Caroline leaned close, lowering her voice as though I were a stranger whose embarrassment she wanted to conceal. "Mom, I'm so sorry, but there's been a change of plans. You can't come with us this time." And I actually staggered, gripping the arm of the chair beside me for balance. "What do you mean? I don't understand," I whispered, my throat dry as dust, and Brian, who had always called me Mrs. Lawson even after 20 years of marriage to my daughter, shifted uncomfortably before muttering, "It's turned into more of a work trip. My boss is joining. It wouldn't be right for you to tag along." But I had been a wife, a mother, a businesswoman in my own small way. I knew the truth when I saw it, and I saw it written all over her posture, the way she fiddled with her bracelet, the way she avoided my gaze, the way guilt flickered just beneath the surface of her polished exterior. This wasn't about Brian's boss. This was about me, about them not wanting me there, about me being a burden, and I felt the humiliation rise hot and sharp in my chest. I tried to salvage it. I offered to stay in a different hotel, to give them space, to cover my own expenses. But Caroline's voice turned sharp, dismissive, in that way I remembered from her teenage years. "Mom, it's already decided. Please just go home." And as my heart cracked, my granddaughter Madison tugged on her mother's sleeve, whispering, "But Mom, you said Grandma was coming to see the dolphins," her young voice quivering with confusion. And Caroline, jaw tight, pushed her toward Brian with a curt, "Go sit with your father. This is grown-up business." And I knelt before Madison, forcing a smile onto my face, though tears pricked behind my eyes. "It's all right, sweetheart. Grandma has a few things to take care of at home. You enjoy those dolphins for me and take lots of pictures." And Madison nodded, with the sadness far too old for her age, while Daniel buried himself in his phone, trying to escape the tension around him. And then the loudspeaker crackled, announcing boarding for their flight to Nassau. And without another glance, without even a proper goodbye, Caroline gathered her family, walked to the gate, and handed her boarding pass. And I called after her, my voice trembling but strong, "Caroline, is this really how you want me to remember you? Is this how you want your children to see you treat your own mother?" And for the briefest flicker of a second, I saw guilt in her eyes. But then she turned, ushering Brian and the kids down the jetway, leaving me standing there like discarded luggage, a 74-year-old widow who had spent months dreaming of inclusion only to be rejected in the most public, humiliating way. And as the gate agent closed the door and the plane pushed back from the gate, I stood rooted in place, my chest hollow, my body trembling, my dignity in shreds. But beneath the pain, beneath the humiliation, something else stirred, something fierce and sharp and long buried, a fire, a resolve I had not felt since Walter died, the realization that Caroline had mistaken my unconditional love for endless toleration, that she believed I would simply slink home, lick my wounds, and wait to be summoned again when convenient. But she was wrong, so terribly wrong, because in that moment, instead of calling a cab, I scrolled past the taxi number and dialed an old contact, a private aviation service in Marietta I hadn't used in years. And when the calm voice on the other end answered, I said clearly, "This is Margaret Lawson. I need a flight to Chicago immediately." And as the arrangements were made, as I gathered my bag and walked toward the private terminal, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. And the woman looking back at me wasn't the discarded, diminished mother Caroline thought she had abandoned at gate B19. No, this woman had steel in her spine, fire in her eyes, and a dangerous kind of resolve, because Caroline had just reminded me of something she should never have forgotten. I was Margaret Lawson, and when you push a mother too far, you awaken a side of her that is far more powerful than anyone expects.
The ride to the private terminal at Hartsfield felt strangely calm, as if the storm that had erupted inside me at gate B19 had burned away everything but a hard, clear determination. And by the time I stepped out of the black town car and into the sleek glass lobby of Lawson Aviation Services, a company Walter and I had quietly invested in decades ago, I felt less like a humiliated grandmother and more like a woman finally waking from a long sleep, remembering who she really was. The uniformed attendant greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Lawson, it's been a while. Your aircraft is ready." And hearing that, knowing I still had resources, power, and choices, steadied me in a way nothing else could have. Because Caroline thought she had left me powerless at the gate, but in truth, she had no idea who her mother really was. And as I settled into the leather seat of the waiting Gulfstream, I thought about the years of careful construction I had put into a modest image. The two-bedroom bungalow in Decatur that looked unassuming from the street, the decade-old Buick I drove to Sunday service, the discount dresses that hung in my closet, all part of a deliberate disguise I had crafted so Caroline would feel like she was building her own success, not realizing that her comfortable suburban home in Alpharetta, her children's private school tuition, even the family vacations that filled her social media feeds had all been quietly supplemented by checks written from accounts she didn't know existed. Walter and I had built our fortune not loudly, but strategically, starting with a small logistics company in Savannah that grew into Lawson Freight Systems, which, by the time we sold our majority stake in the late 90s, had made us multi-millionaires. And while Walter had been the public face, I had been the strategist, the one who read contracts word for word, the one who negotiated property acquisitions, the one who insisted we reinvest dividends instead of buying bigger houses or flashier cars. And after his death 12 years ago, I had continued to manage our holdings, from our shares in regional banks to our stake in Lawson Aviation, with the same quiet discipline. Never telling Caroline because I thought shielding her from the reality of our wealth would give her confidence in her own accomplishments. But now, as the plane climbed into the morning sky, leaving behind the commercial flight that carried my dismissive daughter and her family to Nassau,
I realized that my choice to stay small had not protected her at all. It had enabled her to believe she could treat me like a resource instead of a person, a convenience instead of a mother. The engines hummed steady as I opened my phone and scrolled to Jonathan Pierce, my longtime attorney in Chicago, and when his voice came through, warm but alert, "Margaret, what a surprise." I didn't hesitate. "Jonathan, I need to meet today. Urgent family financial matters." And he immediately understood, arranging for a driver to meet me at Midway, because Jonathan had known me long enough to recognize when I wasn't calling as the grandmother from Decatur, but as the majority partner in Lawson Holdings, the woman who could shift millions with a signature. As the Gulf Stream cut through the clouds, I let my mind drift through the years of small humiliations I had endured from Caroline. The Thanksgiving when she seated me at the far end of the table like an afterthought, while Brian's parents held court at the center. The Christmas morning when I was handed a robe and slippers while her children opened iPads and designer sneakers, paid for ironically with money I had quietly provided. The spring Caroline's washing machine broke and I rushed over to help, only to end up at the laundromat doing her family's laundry while she went to her Pilates class, telling me with a breezy laugh, "You're so good at this domestic stuff, Mom. I never learned to work those coin machines." And I had smiled then, convincing myself it was love, when in truth it was convenience, and I had let it go on for far too long. The pilot's voice broke through my thoughts, announcing our descent into Chicago, and as the city skyline came into view, the old steel and glass towers rising against Lake Michigan, I felt my resolve crystallize. I wasn't here just to lick wounds. I was here to make changes that Caroline would feel, changes that would teach her that love without respect is exploitation, and I would no longer allow myself to be exploited. At the terminal, my driver Thomas, a loyal man who had been ferrying me for years, greeted me with a smile. "Mrs. Lawson, straight to Morrison and Pierce?" And I nodded, sinking into the leather-back seat as we roved through the busy streets of the Loop, my heart beating with the strange exhilaration of taking back control. Jonathan was waiting for me in the marble reception area of his law firm, tall and silver-haired, the kind of man who projected authority without raising his voice. And when he saw my face, he didn't waste time with pleasantries, ushering me into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. "Tell me everything," he said. And so I did. About the airport, about Caroline's casual dismissal, about the years of being treated like a safety net rather than a mother. And as I spoke, I saw his jaw tighten, his fingers steeple beneath his chin, and his eyes sharpen with the protective anger of a man who had seen this pattern before. "How long has this been going on?" he asked when I finished. And I answered honestly, "Years, maybe decades, but it ended at gate B19 this morning." And then I laid out what I wanted: an immediate end to all financial transfers to Caroline and Brian, revocation of the quiet monthly supplement I had been providing toward their mortgage, termination of the tuition payments I had been covering at St. Augustine Academy, and a letter drafted with professional clarity, not emotional fire, explaining exactly what they were losing and why. Because this wasn't revenge, it was consequence. And I wanted Caroline to understand that actions have costs. Jonathan raised his eyebrows. "You're sure, Margaret? Once we set this in motion, it will be irreversible without damaging your authority." And I nodded, my voice steady. "I've been diminished long enough, Jonathan. If my own daughter can look me in the eye and lie to me, then turn her back on me at an airport gate, she can live without my money." And with that, the decision was sealed. As he drafted documents, I began making calls from the polished oak cable, my voice cool and precise. First to my bank, instructing them to halt all automatic transfers to Caroline's accounts, then to the school, notifying them that tuition payments would cease after the current semester, then to the property manager who handled the vacation home in Hilton Head that Caroline had assumed was a family property when in reality it belonged solely to me, informing him that I wanted it withdrawn from their summer use. And with each call, each decisive act, I felt lighter, as though I were shedding years of invisible weight. By late afternoon, Jonathan slid a packet across the table, neatly bound, my signature lines marked with tabs, and I signed each one with a steady hand, my name looping across the paper not as the forgotten mother, but as the woman I had always been beneath the disguise, the woman who built businesses and balanced accounts, the woman who demanded respect. When it was done, Jonathan leaned back, studying me. Margaret, you understand that this will likely rupture your relationship with Caroline, perhaps permanently. And I thought of her sharp voice at the gate, her quick dismissal, her turning her back on me without hesitation. And I said, if a relationship cannot survive me demanding basic respect, then it isn't a relationship worth saving. And with that, I gathered my things. Stepping back into the cool Chicago evening, the city lights flickering against the river. And for the first time in years, I felt powerful. Not the power of money, though I had that, but the power of a woman who had finally remembered her worth. And as Thomas drove me back toward the airport for my return flight, I thought of Caroline, blissfully unaware in her first-class seat bound for Nassau, and I almost smiled, because she thought she had abandoned her aging mother at gate B19, but what she had really done was awaken someone she had never met. Margaret Lawson, the woman who would no longer be diminished, the woman who would make sure her daughter finally learned that respect is not optional, not even for family. The return flight from Chicago touched down in Atlanta just as dusk painted the sky in streaks of violet and gold. And as I rode back to my quiet house in Decatur, I felt like a woman walking into the familiar walls of her old life wearing an entirely new skin. Because the place looked the same. The modest living room with its worn recliner, the faded family photos on the mantel, the kitchen counters where I had cooked 1,000 meals for Walter and Caroline. But nothing inside me was the same. Not after the decisions I had made in Jonathan's conference room. Decisions that would send shockwaves through Caroline's carefully curated suburban world the moment she returned from Nassau. I poured myself a glass of Chardonnay and sat at the small oak table in the kitchen, staring at the framed photo of Caroline on her wedding day, so radiant in her white gown with Brian beaming at her side. And I remembered how proud I had been then, how certain I was that all my sacrifices had been worth it to see my only daughter secure and happy. And now, with a kind of aching clarity, I realized that somewhere along the way, my sacrifices had turned into expectations on her part, unspoken but heavy. The assumption that I would always be there to soften every blow, to write every check, to fill every gap. I thought back to Christmas 3 years ago when Caroline insisted on hosting at her Alpharetta home, and the entire day passed with me relegated to the kitchen, chopping vegetables, setting the table, cleaning up after everyone, while Brian's mother perched like a queen in the living room sipping her wine. And I told myself then that I was useful, needed, even loved. But now, in the sharper light of truth, I saw it for what it was, convenience. And there was the summer Caroline's car broke down, and instead of asking Brian to handle it, she called me in tears. "Mom, I don't know what to do. The dealership says it'll take weeks." And without hesitation, I wrote a check for the down payment on a new SUV, thinking I was giving her security, when really I was teaching her that Mom would always step in, no matter the cost. Those memories piled up as I sat in the dim kitchen, and by the time I drained my glass, I knew I couldn't keep living in the modest disguise I had built for her benefit. So the next morning, I called my realtor, an old friend named Diane Webb, and said plainly, "Diane, I need you to find me something downtown, something elegant, something that reflects who I really am." And though she sputtered in surprise, she knew better than to question. And by afternoon, she was walking me through a penthouse in Midtown Atlanta with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Piedmont Park, marble counters gleaming in the sun, and a master suite that felt like a 5-star hotel. And as I stood there, taking in the view of the skyline, I felt a surge of joy that nearly knocked me off my feet, because for the first time since Walter's passing, I was making a decision for myself, Not for my daughter, not for my grandchildren, not to play a role, but because it was what I wanted. I made a cash offer on the spot, and when Diane's eyebrows shot up, I only smiled, thinking of how Caroline would react when she learned her mother, whom she had treated like a dependent old woman, had purchased a multi-million-dollar penthouse without blinking. Over the next week, as movers packed up the Decatur house and delivered my belongings to Midtown, I also reactivated parts of my life that had been dormant for too long. I called Morrison and Pierce to schedule my return to the board meetings I had quietly avoided for years. I rang up my personal shopper at Neiman Marcus to refresh my wardrobe with clothes that announce confidence instead of hiding it. I booked appointments at the salon and spa I used to frequent when Walter was alive. And with each step, I felt layers of invisibility peel away, revealing the woman I used to be, the woman Caroline had never really known. Meanwhile, through my attorney's courier service, the documents I had signed in Chicago were delivered to Caroline's front porch in Alpharetta on Tuesday morning at 10:07 a.m., the exact time I had arranged. And though I wasn't there to see her face when she opened that thick envelope, I could imagine it. Her confusion turning to disbelief, disbelief to anger, anger to panic, as she realized that the house payment subsidy, the tuition checks, the quiet transfers into her account, all of it was gone in 30 days, and that her comfortable life had been built not on her own success, but on the generosity of the mother she had abandoned at an airport gate. I didn't expect to hear from her immediately. Caroline had always been one to calculate her next move before reacting, but I knew the call would come, and in the meantime I relished my transformation, because when I looked in the mirror of my new penthouse bathroom, framed by sleek marble and lit by crystal sconces, I saw not the tired widow from Decatur, but a woman reborn, her silver hair styled with sophistication, her posture straight, her eyes bright with determination. 3 days later, on a Friday morning, as I sipped espresso on my balcony overlooking Piedmont, my phone rang with the caller ID I had been waiting for, Caroline. And I let it buzz 4 times before answering, a tactic Walter always used in negotiations to remind the other party that you're never desperate for the call. And when I finally answered with a calm, "Hello, Caroline," her voice came through sharp, high-pitched, laced with panic. "Mom, what the hell is this letter? What do you mean you're cutting off the house payments, the tuition, everything?" And I kept my tone even, sipping my coffee. "It means exactly what it says, sweetheart. The financial support ends in 30 days. And then came the pleading, the bargaining. "But Mom, we depend on that money. You know our expenses. You know the kids' school. You know—" And I cut her off. "Yes, I know, Caroline, because I've been paying for most of it. But it's time you and Brian take responsibility for your own lives." And for a long moment, there was silence on the line. The silence of a woman realizing her world was not as stable as she believed. And I knew then that the real storm was only beginning. But unlike the one at Gate B19, this storm was of my own making. And for once, I was the one in control. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought for a moment Caroline might hang up. But instead, she erupted, her voice turning sharp with a kind of fury that reminded me of a cornered animal. "I can't believe you would do this to your own daughter, Mom, after everything we've done for you." And I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, because what exactly had she done for me except treat me like an obligation, seating me at the edge of her dinner parties, calling me only when she needed something, parading me in front of her friends as though I were a sweet old accessory to her perfect suburban life. And I answered calmly, "Caroline, you've had everything handed to you, not by Brian, not by your own work, but by me. And if you want to be treated like an adult, it's time you lived like one." And that silence came again, heavy with disbelief, before she hissed, "Brian is going to be furious, you know that. He's already saying we should move in with you if things get tight." And I almost choked on my espresso, because the idea of Brian, with his smug smile and endless criticisms, lounging in my new Midtown penthouse was laughable. And I replied coolly, "That will never happen, Caroline. Not now, not ever," before ending the call. And as I set the phone down, I realized my hands were steady, not shaking as they would have been a year ago, and that steadiness was power. The following week, while Caroline and Brian scrambled back from Nassau to face the financial reality waiting in their mailbox, I immersed myself in my new life, attending my first Lost in Holdings board meeting in over a decade, walking into that mahogany-lined conference room in a tailored navy dress, my hair swept back, my pearls gleaming, and watching the surprise flicker across the faces of men who had assumed I was long retired. And when I spoke, clearly, decisively, laying out my vision for reinvesting in regional transport hubs, the room went quiet with respect. And in that moment, I felt more alive than I had in years. Later that evening, I dined with Jonathan and his wife at a quiet French restaurant in Buckhead. And over creme brulee, Jonathan leaned close and said softly, "Margaret, I have to tell you, it's extraordinary to see you step back into your own power." And I smiled, not just because of the compliment, but because it was true. I was finally living as myself, not as the diminished version Caroline had come to expect. Meanwhile, the calls from Caroline escalated, first pleading, then angry, then threatening, until one afternoon she showed up unannounced at my penthouse, pounding on the glass doors of the lobby until the doorman called up to ask if I would see her. And against my better judgment, I agreed, because I needed her to see me here, in this space, on my terms. She stormed into the marble foyer, her heels clicking furiously against the polished floor, her eyes wild, and she spat. "How could you humiliate me like this, Mom? Do you know what people will say when they find out we can't pay for the kids' school, when they see us cut back? Everyone will think we're failures." And I let her rant, let her words echo against the high ceilings, before I answered quietly, but firmly. "Caroline, people don't measure your worth by how much money you spend. They measure it by how you treat those who love you. And if you're humiliated, it isn't because I stopped paying. It's because you never respected me enough to admit the truth about where it all came from." And I saw the sting of those words hit her, but instead of reflection, she doubled down. "You're punishing me because you're bitter, because you're lonely, because Dad isn't here to stop you." And at that, my heart did crack a little, because hearing Walter's name used as a weapon by my own daughter was almost unbearable. But I steeled myself, answering, "Your father would be ashamed to see how you've treated me, Caroline, ashamed." And for the first time, her eyes filled with tears, real ones, not the manipulative ones I'd seen so many times before. And she whispered, "You don't understand, Mom. Brian said if we don't get the money, he'll leave. He'll take the kids. And I can't—" But I cut her off. "Then maybe it's time you saw what kind of man you married. Because if money is the only thing keeping him, he was never truly yours." And with that, she crumpled, sinking onto the cream sofa like a child. And I stood tall, the roles reversed, me the strong one, her the frightened. And I realized then that while cutting her off financially was necessary, it was only the beginning of teaching her what resilience truly meant. She left that night without hugging me, her face pale, her eyes hard. And though it broke a piece of my heart, I refused to back down, because backing down now would erase everything I had thought to reclaim. The next day, I received a call from Madison, my granddaughter, her young voice trembling as she asked, "Grandma, are you mad at us? Mommy cries a lot now." And I answered gently, "No, darling, I could never be mad at you. And Mommy will be okay. She just has to learn some lessons about life, the same way we all do." And Madison sniffled, "I miss you." And I promised her, "I miss you too, sweetheart. And we'll spend time together soon, just you and me." And after we hung up, I sat for a long time staring out over the park, tears slipping down my cheeks. Because in all of this, the children were the innocent ones, caught in the middle of a storm their parents had created. And I swore to myself that while Caroline would face consequences, Madison and Daniel would never pay for their mother's mistakes. That night, I began drafting a new trust, one that would bypass Caroline and Brian entirely, securing my grandchildren's future education and well-being directly, so that no matter how reckless their parents became, Madison and Daniel would always have a safety net, but one controlled by me, not by the daughter who had abandoned me at Gate B19. The following week unfolded like the slow tightening of a vice, each day bringing a new sign that Caroline and Brian's carefully constructed world was beginning to crack without the invisible scaffolding of my money. And though part of me ached to see my daughter struggle, a stronger part of me knew this was the only way she might finally face the truth of her own life. It began with a call from St. Augustine Academy, the private school in Alpharetta where Madison and Daniel were enrolled, informing me that tuition for the upcoming semester was overdue. And though I had already told them I would no longer be responsible for payment, they still reached out as a courtesy, perhaps expecting I might change my mind. But I did not, and I calmly told the administrator, if their parents cannot handle it, then it's time to discuss alternatives. And I could almost hear the shock in her pause, because for years they had known me as the reliable benefactor who always made things right. 2 days later, Caroline left me a string of frantic voicemails, her voice ragged from crying. "Mom, please, we can't afford public school. Brian says it would humiliate us. The kids are used to their friends there. You can't do this to them." But I deleted each message after listening only once. Because this wasn't about the children. It was about Caroline's pride, her desperate need to keep up appearances. And I knew the sooner she faced reality, the sooner she might actually grow. Then came the news from the bank, relayed by my own account manager, that Caroline and Brian's mortgage payment had bounced, their Alpharetta McMansion suddenly heavier than they could carry without the quiet monthly check I had been sending. And I pictured Brian pacing in his office, his jaw tight with anger, blaming Caroline for not convincing me to relent. And in a bitter way, I almost felt sorry for her, trapped between a husband who saw her as a tool for his ambition and a mother who had finally stopped enabling her weakness. But the true breaking point arrived on a humid Saturday morning when Caroline herself appeared at my midtown penthouse once again, this time not with fury, but with desperation. Her face drawn, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes hollow as though she hadn't slept in days. And she didn't even wait to be invited in. She collapsed against the doorframe and sobbed, "Mom, we're losing everything. Brian says he won't stay if we can't keep the house. The kids are terrified. Please, please don't do this." And for a long moment, every instinct in me screamed to pull her close, to stroke her hair the way I had when she was little, to promise her it would all be okay. But I forced myself to stay steady, to remember the humiliation of Gate B19, the years of being used as a wallet instead of cherished as a mother. And I said quietly, "Caroline, I am not doing this to you. You did this to yourself by never respecting me or valuing what I gave. And until you understand that, nothing will change." And her sobs turned to rage, her tears drying instantly as she spat, "You're a bitter old woman, jealous of your own daughter. That's all this is." And with that, she stormed out, leaving the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. And I sank into my chair trembling, because no matter how strong I tried to be, hearing those words from my own child cut deeper than any knife. Later that evening, as I sat alone with a cup of chamomile tea, my phone buzzed again, this time not from Caroline, but from Madison. A simple text that read, "Grandma, can I come stay with you for a while?" And my heart twisted, because I knew she was only 12, far too young to be caught in the middle of her parents' chaos, but I also knew she was reaching for safety, for love, for the steadiness she could not find at home. And I replied, "Of course, sweetheart, anytime." And 2 days later, Madison arrived at my penthouse with a small duffel bag and eyes too old for their years. And as I hugged her, she whispered, Mom and Dad fight all the time now. Daniel hides in his room, and I don't know what to do. And I promised her softly, "You don't have to do anything, darling. Just be a child. Let me take care of the rest." And in that moment, I understood the true shape of my revenge. It wasn't about punishing Caroline anymore. It was about saving my grandchildren from becoming collateral damage in her downfall. I spent that week with Madison, taking her to the art museum, baking cookies in my gleaming new kitchen, reading to her at night in the guest suite. And for the first time in years, I felt the joy of motherhood again, not in the form of sacrifice, but in the form of connection, love freely given and freely returned. And when Daniel came the following weekend, quiet and withdrawn, I welcomed him too, telling him he was always safe here. And soon my penthouse echoed with the laughter of children, a sound I hadn't realized I had been starving for. Meanwhile, Caroline's calls grew fewer, her pride too wounded to admit she was losing her grip, and Brian's presence evaporated altogether, as if he had already decided to cut his losses, leaving Caroline to flounder alone. And though part of me mourned for the daughter I once adored, another part of me knew this was the necessary breaking before the rebuilding. And as I tucked Madison and Daniel into bed one night, their faces peaceful in the soft glow of the city lights outside, I whispered a silent promise to Walter. "Don't worry, my love. I'll make sure our legacy isn't wasted. I'll protect them, even if their mother cannot." And in that promise, I found strength, because I knew the battle was only halfway done. But for the first time, I also knew I would win.
The shift in my household was so sudden it felt almost surreal, going from years of lonely dinners and quiet evenings to the bustle of children's voices echoing through my penthouse halls. And though my heart ached for the reasons that brought Madison and Daniel to me, I also felt a deep sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years, because here, under my roof, they were safe, cherished, and free from the constant tension that had poisoned their parents' home. But as the children settled in, Caroline's silence grew heavier, and I knew something was brewing, because my daughter was never one to retreat for long. And sure enough, on a blustery Wednesday morning, Jonathan called to inform me that Caroline had reached out, demanding access to the trust I had established for the grandchildren, insisting that as their mother she should have control over it. And Jonathan's voice was tinged with irritation as he said, "She even accused you of manipulating them against her, Margaret." But I told her firmly the trust is ironclad, she has no standing. And though his words reassured me, I also felt the sting of Caroline's accusation, because I had never once spoken ill of her to Madison or Daniel, yet she assumed my strength must mean her weakness was being exposed, when in truth, her children had simply found refuge where love was steady and unconditional. Later that day, Caroline appeared again at my building. But this time she was not alone. She brought Brian, who looked as sour as ever, his jaw clenched, his expensive watch flashing as he gestured wildly at the doorman, insisting they be allowed up. And though every instinct told me to turn them away, I decided to face them, because hiding would only feed their narrative. And so I buzzed them in. They stormed into my foyer, Caroline with red-rimmed eyes, Brian with anger radiating off him like heat. And he wasted no time. "This has gone too far, Margaret. You've poisoned our children against us. You've cut us off financially, and now you're parading around in this penthouse like some queen. This isn't who you are." And I stood tall, my pearls catching the light, my voice calm. "On the contrary, Brian, this is exactly who I am. You just never bothered to look closely." And his face flushed crimson, unused to being challenged, while Caroline began pacing, wringing her hands. "Mom, please, just give us access to the trust. Let us manage things for the kids. You know we'll do right by them." And I felt something inside me harden, because I knew what she meant. Access to keep up appearances, to maintain the lifestyle she was so desperate to protect, not to truly care for Madison and Daniel. And I answered, "No, Caroline, the trust is for them, not for you. And until you can prove you put their needs above your own pride, you will never touch it." And she gasped, as though I had struck her, while Brian sneered. "This is pathetic, an old woman playing puppet master. You'll regret this when you're alone again." And at that,
Madison, who had been standing quietly by the staircase, suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling but fierce. "She's not alone. We're here, and she loves us more than you ever do when you're fighting all the time." And the silence that followed was deafening. Brian sputtering, Caroline turning pale, me blinking back tears of pride at my granddaughter's courage. And for the first time, the power dynamic shifted so completely that I saw fear flicker in Brian's eyes, because he realized his grip on the family was slipping. And with a final glare, he muttered, "Let's go, Caroline," dragging her toward the door. And she followed without another word, leaving me standing with Madison and Daniel, both of them looking shaken but resolute. And I pulled them close, whispering, "You did so well, my loves. You spoke your truth." And in that moment, I knew that no matter how ugly this battle became, I was no longer just fighting for myself. I was fighting for them. The next few days were strangely quiet, almost too quiet. And though part of me feared the storm to come, I also reveled in the small joys of our new life together. Cooking breakfast with Madison at my side, helping Daniel with his math homework at the marble kitchen island, watching movies together on the big sectional sofa, the city skyline glittering beyond the windows. And I thought often of Walter, imagining him smiling at the sight of his grandchildren safe and happy in my care. But just as peace began to settle, another call came, this time from Jonathan. His voice tight. "Margaret, I've just been served notice. Caroline and Brian are filing a petition for guardianship, claiming you're unfit to care for the children." And my knees nearly gave out. Because though I knew it was a desperate ploy, the thought of them using the courts to try and strip me of Madison and Daniel's trust and presence in my life made my blood run cold. And I whispered, "They wouldn't dare." But Jonathan's tone was grim. "They're desperate, Margaret, and desperation makes people reckless. But don't worry, we'll fight this and we'll win." And as I hung up, my reflection in the glass door caught my eye, and I saw not fear, but fire. Because if Caroline thought gate B19 was the day I broke, she had no idea that all she had done was awaken the strongest version of me, the version that would not rest until my grandchildren were safe and the world finally saw who Margaret Lawson truly was. The petition hearing was set for late September at the Fulton County Courthouse, and the days leading up to it were a blur of depositions, affidavits, and strategy meetings with Jonathan, who assured me over and over that the law was on my side. But still, the idea of standing in a courtroom while my own daughter tried to paint me as unfit clawed at my chest like a living thing. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a tailored charcoal suit, low black heels, and a strand of Walter's pearls, because I wanted the judge to see me not as a frail old widow, but as the capable woman I had always been. And when Madison hugged me before I left, whispering, "I believe in you, Grandma," I carried her words like armor. At the courthouse, Caroline and Brian were already seated with their attorney, a slick young man in a navy suit who looked like he specialized in aggressive divorces. And Caroline avoided my eyes, her face drawn but determined, while Brian smirked as though the outcome were already written in his favor. But when the judge entered and the proceedings began, it quickly became clear they had underestimated me. Their lawyer opened with a performance worthy of the stage, painting me as a manipulative, lonely old woman who had lured her grandchildren away from their parents, claiming I was unstable, controlling, even suggesting I had alienated the children against Caroline and Brian. But when it was my turn, Jonathan rose with quiet authority and dismantled every accusation, producing records of my financial stability, testimony from Madison's teachers about the improvement in her demeanor since staying with me, and even letters from neighbors praising the safe, nurturing environment I had provided. And then, in a move that left Brian's lawyer sputtering, Jonathan called Madison herself to speak. And though she was only 12, the judge allowed it in chambers with both legal teams present. And my heart swelled with pride as Madison, her voice steady but soft, told the judge, "My grandma doesn't make me choose sides. She just loves me. She helps me with school, she listens when I'm scared, and I feel safe with her." And the judge, a stern woman with kind eyes, leaned forward and asked, "Do you feel safe with your parents?" And Madison hesitated before whispering, "When they're not fighting." And that silence spoke louder than anything else. When the hearing concluded, the judge declined Caroline and Brian's petition, ruling that I was perfectly fit to care for the children temporarily and that the trust remained intact under my control. And though the battle wasn't over, the victory was so sweet I almost wept in the courthouse lobby. While Caroline stormed past me, her face pale, muttering, "This isn't over, Mom," and Brian shot me a look of pure venom. But for the first time, I didn't flinch. That evening, back in my penthouse, Madison and Daniel ran to greet me, their eyes searching my face for the verdict. And when I told them we had won, they erupted into cheers. Daniel throwing his arms around me, Madison laughing with relief, and I held them close, whispering, "No matter what happens, you will always have me." And in that moment, I knew I had already won the only battle that mattered. Yet even as joy filled my home, I knew Caroline would not stop because she was too entangled with Brian, too desperate to preserve the illusion of their perfect life. And sure enough, a week later, Jonathan called to warn me that Brian had filed a separate motion to contest the trust itself, trying to argue that as Madison and Daniel's father, he had a right to manage their inheritance. And though Jonathan assured me the trust was airtight, I felt the familiar burn of anger at his audacity, the way he kept reaching for what was not his, as though everything I had built with Walter were simply fodder for his greed. But if Brian wanted a war, I would give him one. And this time I would fight not just with lawyers, but with truth. Because for years I had remained silent about the ways he belittled Caroline, the way he dismissed me, the way he used money as a weapon. And now I realized that silence had only empowered him. I began documenting everything. Emails Caroline had forwarded me over the years where Brian mocked her for being soft. Voicemails where he barked demands for money. Even photographs from Christmases where his coldness stood out stark against the warmth of others. And as I compiled this quiet arsenal, I felt no guilt, only resolve, because protecting my grandchildren meant exposing the ugliness their parents tried so hard to hide. Meanwhile, Caroline grew more desperate, her calls alternating between begging me to relent and accusing me of destroying her marriage, until one evening she screamed down the line, "If Brian leaves, it will be your fault, Mom, your fault." And I answered calmly, "If Brian leaves, it will be because he was never a husband worth keeping." And I hung up, my hand steady, my heart lighter, because I no longer feared her words. That evening, back in my penthouse, Madison and Daniel ran to greet me, their eyes searching my face for the verdict. And when I told them we had won, they erupted into cheers. Daniel throwing his arms around me, Madison laughing with relief, and I held them close, whispering, "No matter what happens, you will always have me." And in that moment, I knew I had already won the only battle that mattered. Yet even as joy filled my home, I knew Caroline would not stop, because she was too entangled with Brian, too desperate to preserve the illusion of their perfect life. And sure enough, a week later, Jonathan called to warn me that Brian had filed a separate motion to contest the trust itself, trying to argue that as Madison and Daniel's father, he had a right to manage their inheritance. And though Jonathan assured me the trust was airtight, I felt the familiar burn of anger at his audacity, the way he kept reaching for what was not his, as though everything I had built with Walter were simply fodder for his greed. But if Brian wanted a war, I would give him one. And this time I would fight not just with lawyers, but with truth. Because for years I had remained silent about the ways he belittled Caroline, the way he dismissed me, the way he used money as a weapon. And now I realized that silence had only empowered him. I began documenting everything. Emails Caroline had forwarded me over the years where Brian mocked her for being soft. Voicemails where he barked demands for money. Even photographs from Christmases where his coldness stood out stark against the warmth of others. And as I compiled this quiet arsenal, I felt no guilt, only resolve. Because protecting my grandchildren meant exposing the ugliness their parents tried so hard to hide. Meanwhile, Caroline grew more desperate, her calls alternating between begging me to relent and accusing me of destroying her marriage, until one evening she screamed down the line, "If Brian leaves, it will be your fault, Mom, your fault." And I answered calmly, "If Brian leaves, it will be because he was never a husband worth keeping." And I hung up, my hand steady, my heart lighter, because I no longer feared her words. That evening, as I tucked Madison and Daniel into bed, Daniel looked up at me with wide eyes and whispered, "Grandma, are we going to have to choose who to live with?" And I stroked his hair gently, answering, "No, sweetheart, you don't have to choose, because I will always make sure you are safe wherever you are." And though I prayed it would be true, I also knew the fight ahead would test me more than anything else in my 74 years. But I was ready, because I was no longer just Margaret Lawson, the widow, the mother who had been abandoned at gate B19. I was Margaret Lawson, the grandmother who had remembered her power, and I would not stop until my family finally understood what that meant. The weeks that followed the courtroom victory were filled with a strange, tense quiet, like the eye of a storm. And though I tried to focus on giving Madison and Daniel as much stability as I could, packing their lunches each morning, helping them with homework in the evenings, even walking them to the corner bakery on Saturdays for cinnamon rolls, I could feel the undercurrent of unease. The sense that Caroline and Brian were plotting their next move. And sure enough, the first crack appeared when a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution left a voicemail on my office line asking for comment about alleged financial manipulation within the Lawson family. And I knew instantly that Brian had leaked something to the press, hoping to twist public perception against me. But what he hadn't counted on was my long history in business, my network of friends and allies who respected me, and my ironclad paper trail that proved every decision I had made was above board. And when Jonathan confirmed that Brian's sources were weak, little more than hearsay, I instructed him to release a statement that reframed the entire narrative, not of an old woman manipulating her children, but of a grandmother protecting her grandchildren from financial recklessness. And within 48 hours, the article Brian had been counting on to shame me instead painted me as a symbol of resilience. The comments section filled with strangers praising me for standing my ground, and I almost smiled as I imagined Brian's face when he read it. But the victories did not erase the pain at home, because Caroline, desperate and unraveling, began calling Madison directly, her voice heavy with guilt and manipulation. "Sweetheart, don't you miss me? Don't you want to come home? Grandma is turning you against me." And when Madison showed me her phone, tears in her eyes, asking, "Why would Mommy say that?" my heart nearly broke. But I held her close and told her softly, "Your mother is hurting right now, but that doesn't mean what she says is true, and none of this is your fault." And I made a decision then to block Caroline's number from Madison's phone, not to cut her out forever, but to give my granddaughter peace, because no child should be made to carry the weight of a parent's mistakes. Daniel, quieter and more withdrawn, confided one night while I tucked him in, "Grandma, Dad says you're trying to steal us, but I don't want to leave here. I feel safe here." And I kissed his forehead, whispering, "You're not being stolen, sweetheart. You're being loved, and love is never theft." And as he drifted to sleep, I promised myself I would carry that truth for both of them until they were old enough to carry it themselves. Then came the breaking point. Brian's arrogance finally overreached when he attempted to liquidate assets he didn't own, forging Caroline's signature on documents tied to a small property in Hilton Head that was legally under my name alone, and the bank flagged it immediately, alerting Jonathan, who brought the evidence straight to me. And when I saw Brian's sloppy forgery, his desperation naked on the page, I felt a cold satisfaction, because this was the proof we needed, not just to shut him down legally, but to expose him for what he truly was. Within days, Jonathan filed counterclaims, accusing Brian of attempted fraud and requesting that the court review his financial dealings more broadly. And suddenly, the man who had strutted into my pit house with sneers and threats was now cornered, his reputation teetering, his arrogance crumbling. And though Caroline tried to defend him at first, insisting through tears, "He just made a mistake, Mom. He's under pressure." Even she couldn't deny the evidence piling against him. One evening, after another long day of meetings, I returned to my penthouse to find Caroline waiting outside alone, her eyes swollen, her clothes rumpled. And when I let her in, she sank into the armchair and whispered, "He's leaving, Mom. Brian's leaving. He said he won't be dragged down by me and the kids. He called me dead weight." And though a part of me wanted to say I had warned her, I held my tongue, because the broken woman in front of me wasn't the sharp-tongued daughter who had humiliated me at the airport. It was the frightened girl I had raised, finally seeing the truth. And I sat beside her, taking her hand, saying gently, "Then let him leave, Caroline. Let him show you who he really is, because you and the children deserve better." And she wept, not polite tears, but guttural sobs that shook her whole body. And for the first time in years, she leaned into me, not as a critic or manipulator, but as a daughter in need of her mother. Later that night, after she left to gather herself, Madison whispered to me, "Grandma, is Mommy going to be okay?" And I answered honestly, "She will. But she has to walk through the storm first, and we'll be here when she comes out the other side." And in that moment, I realized the revenge I had once dreamed at Gate B19 had already transformed into something deeper. Not just reclaiming my dignity, but guiding my family through the fire, even if they had to burn before they understood. Yet still, I couldn't shake the image of Caroline sitting broken in my chair, her voice small, her pride shattered. And though I would never regret cutting her off, I also knew the final chapters of this battle would not just be about money or custody, but about whether my daughter would ever find her way back to me, not as the manipulative woman who had turned her back at the gate, but as the child I once loved beyond all reason. The weeks after Brian's fraud was exposed moved quickly, like dominoes tipping one after the other. And though I had prepared myself for resistance, what I hadn't anticipated was how fast the facade of Caroline's marriage would collapse once the truth was undeniable. Bryant packed his things in less than 48 hours, leaving a scrawled note on the kitchen counter that read, "I can't do this anymore. Don't contact me." And just like that, the man who had sneered at me, who had tried to strip me of dignity and control, vanished without even facing his children. Caroline called me at midnight that night, her voice trembling as she admitted, "He's gone, Mom. He left me with nothing but bills." And though part of me wanted to remind her of every warning she had ignored, I only said, "Then now we begin again, on our own terms." Because I could see, finally, that her arrogance had cracked enough for truth to seep in. The court, bolstered by Jonathan's airtight filings, moved swiftly, granting me full guardianship of Madison and Daniel on a permanent basis, citing Brian's fraud and abandonment as disqualifying. And while Caroline was not stripped of her rights entirely, the judge made it clear that until she demonstrated stability and responsibility, her role would remain limited. And I saw in her eyes as we left the courthouse that this reality stung worse than any punishment I could have devised, because for the first time in her adult life, she had to face consequences she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of. At home, Madison began to flourish in ways I hadn't expected, her grades climbing, her laughter more frequent, her spirit lighter now that the constant undercurrent of tension was gone. And one evening while we baked cookies together, she looked at me with her serious 12-year-old eyes and said, "Grandma, I feel like I can finally breathe here." And those words rooted themselves deep in my heart, affirming every painful choice I had made. Daniel, too, began to blossom, though more quietly, shadowing me through the penthouse as I worked on foundation business, asking endless questions about numbers, contracts, and the world of investments. And when I told him that one day he might take over the work I was building, his face lit up with a pride I hadn't seen before. And I realized that in freeing them from the cycle of dependency their parents had created, I was planting seeds for an entirely different legacy. Caroline, however, remained a storm cloud on the horizon, unpredictable and volatile, sometimes showing up at the penthouse with gifts for the children, trying too hard, her apologies spilling out in waves of desperation. "I know I've failed you, Mom, but I'm trying." And other times disappearing for days, her absence as sharp as her presence. And though Madison would cry at night, asking why her mother kept drifting away, I held her and told her gently, because she's still finding her way, but she loves you even when she doesn't know how to show it. All the while knowing that love without responsibility was a hollow promise. Meanwhile, Brian's downfall spread wider than I expected. His company dropped him, creditors circled, and rumors swirled that he had fled the state to avoid criminal charges. And when Jonathan confirmed that an arrest warrant had been quietly filed in South Carolina for fraudulent misrepresentation, I felt no triumph, only the cold satisfaction of justice finally touching a man who thought himself untouchable. In the midst of all this, the foundation was blooming. Rebecca and I finalized the first slate of grants to help women entrepreneurs, and standing in the boardroom announcing those awards, with Madison and Daniel sitting proudly in the front row, I felt a surge of purpose that carried me far beyond the personal battles, as if every betrayal, every humiliation, every lonely night had led me to this moment of creating something larger than myself. Still, the wounds with Caroline remained raw, and one Saturday afternoon, she appeared at my door, unannounced, her eyes red, but her voice steady. "Mom, I want to earn back your trust, not just for me, but for the kids, because I see now that they thrive with you, and I don't want to lose them completely." And though my instinct was to shield myself, to slam the door on years of pain, I let her in, because I knew this story could not end with only estrangement. It had to move toward a reckoning that included the possibility of repair. We sat for hours, the children listening from the other room, as she confessed piece by piece the truth of her dependency, the way she had leaned on me financially until she forgot how to stand alone, the way Brian had magnified her worst instincts, the way she had felt both resentful of me and desperate for me at the same time. And when she finally whispered, "I'm ashamed of the way I treated you at that airport. I see now that it was the moment I lost not just your support, but myself." I felt the years of hurt pressing against my chest, but I also felt the faint stirrings of forgiveness. Not the blind forgiveness that erases the past, but the cautious forgiveness that acknowledges the pain while offering a path forward. Still, I made it clear, "Caroline, I won't give you money again. I won't erase the consequences of your choices. But if you're willing to rebuild with honesty and effort, I'll walk with you through it." And for the first time in years, she nodded not in defiance, but in acceptance, tears slipping down her cheeks as she said, "That's all we ask." That night, as Madison hugged me tight and whispered, "Grandma, I think Mommy really meant it this time," I realized the story of revenge that had begun at Gate B19 had evolved into something far more complex. Because what I had reclaimed was not just my dignity, but the chance to reshape the future of my family on terms built from truth, boundaries, and strength. And as I tucked the children into bed, their small hands wrapped in mine, I promised silently that no matter what storms came next, the foundation we had built together would hold, because I was no longer the woman abandoned at an airport gate. I was the woman who had chosen herself, her dignity, and her legacy, and in doing so had given her grandchildren the gift of a life not built on illusion, but on resilience. 6 months after that morning at Gate B19, when Caroline walked away with Brian and left me standing alone in Denver International Airport, my life bore little resemblance to the quiet, diminished existence I once accepted as normal, because what began as humiliation had transformed into a rebirth that touched every corner of who I was. And the final proof came one golden evening when Madison School hosted its spring science fair, and I walked into that buzzing gymnasium, my silver hair pinned neatly, my emerald green blazer catching the light, my grandchildren racing toward me with unfiltered joy. And as I hugged them both, I knew I had become the woman they needed me to be. Not just a grandmother filling the gaps their parents left, but a model of resilience, strength, and truth. The projects lined the long tables, trifold boards splashed with color and imagination, and Madison's exhibit on renewable energy shone brighter than most, not just because of her ideas, but because of the confidence with which she explained them, proudly telling her teacher, "My grandma helped me understand the numbers. She's good at business." And when I heard the teacher reply, "Well, you must get that sharpness from her," I smiled, realizing that for once, my identity wasn't hidden behind Caroline's shadow. It was being passed down openly to the next generation. Daniel's project was simpler, a collection of family history artifacts he had carefully arranged, but at the center he had placed a framed photograph of me at a Morrison Financial Board meeting, standing tall at 74, and beneath it he had written in his careful 10-year-old handwriting, "This is my grandma. She's the strongest woman I know." And those words pierced me in the best way possible, because they told me that the story of weakness and dependency had ended with Caroline, and what my grandchildren would inherit instead was a legacy of power and pride. Caroline was there too that night, standing a little apart at first, nervous, her new job at a small marketing agency giving her enough income to cover rent on a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And though she still struggled with the sharp edges of humility, she had stopped making excuses and started making progress, which in itself was a miracle I never thought I'd witness. And when Madison tugged her toward me, insisting, "Mom, come take a picture with Grandma and me," Caroline stepped beside me, hesitant, then whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." And I could see in her tired eyes the beginning of something that might, with time, grow back into trust. Later that week, I stood in the conference room of the Anna Whitman Foundation for Women's Enterprise, watching as the first cohort of grant recipients signed their contracts. Young mothers with dreams of opening bakeries, immigrant women launching cleaning companies, college graduates starting tech consultancies. And I knew with every beat of my heart that this creation, this impact, was the answer to every time I had wondered if my life still held purpose beyond motherhood. Because now my resources were fueling independence in women who might otherwise be trapped by circumstances, and the pride I saw on their faces reminded me of my younger self, clawing for a place in a world that wasn't designed for women like me. Rebecca, my new board partner, leaned over with a smile and whispered, "Mom, they look at you the way I should have all along." And though her voice carried guilt, I squeezed her hand and replied, "No, sweetheart, they look at me the way I finally decided to see myself, because the truth was I had allowed my own light to dim in the name of love. And now, by reigniting it, I was teaching her that love shines brightest when paired with respect." But perhaps the most poignant moment came one quiet Sunday morning when I was having coffee on my penthouse terrace and Daniel padded out in his pajamas, clutching a notebook, asking shyly, "Grandma, can you help me write down my goals? I want to be like you when I grow up, but I don't know where to start." And as we sat together sketching out his ideas, college, maybe law school, maybe business, definitely something with impact, I felt the tears come, because I knew then that the truest revenge against betrayal wasn't anger or punishment, it was legacy, and mine was already alive in the determination of those 2 children. Caroline still had a long road to travel, and I knew she might stumble again, but I had given her no more money, only boundaries. And boundaries had done what wealth never could. They had forced her to grow up at last. And though the scars of her choices would never fully vanish, there was a fragile honesty between us now that felt more real than any of the empty pleasantries we had shared before. Brian, on the other hand, faded into nothingness, a warrant still hanging over his head, his name whispered in lawsuits and scandals, but absent from our lives. And while I once had dreamed of confronting him with the full weight of my resources, I realized I didn't need to. His absence was punishment enough, his irrelevance the sharpest justice of all. And so as I looked out over the Chicago skyline that had witnessed my quiet transformation, I understood that what began at Gate B19 had not been an ending, but a rebirth. The moment a 73-year-old widow remembered that she was still capable of fire, still deserving of respect, still powerful enough to change not just her own life, but the trajectory of her entire family. I wasn't the discarded mother anymore. I wasn't the invisible grandmother. I wasn't the woman shrinking herself to make others comfortable. I was Anna Whitman, a woman who had built empires, raised children, endured betrayal, and emerged not broken, but burning brighter than ever. And as Madison and Daniel burst onto the terrace that morning, chasing each other in laughter, shouting, "Grandma, come play with us," I rose with a smile, because the final twist was not that I had been wealthy all along, not that I had hidden a fortune behind a suburban facade, but that I had been strong all along, and it took losing everything I thought to find me to finally remember the truth. And now, standing tall with my grandchildren's hands in mine, I knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of my life were not behind me, but ahead, written on my own terms, fueled by dignity, love, and the kind of freedom that no betrayal could ever take away again.